Hi there. This is a thought for the day, and this comes from an old book called Love and Addiction. It's by Stanton Peele, and it is a book about love. What is love and what is addiction? And are we addicted to love, what we call love? So this comes from the introduction. I'm reading from page 1, starting on page 1. He says, love and addiction, the juxtaposition seems strange, yet it shouldn't. For addiction has as much to do with love as it does with drugs. Many of us are addicts, only we don't know it. We turn to each other out of the same needs that drive some people to drink and others to heroin. And this kind of addiction is just as self-destructive as, and a lot more common than, those other kinds, like to drugs and chemicals. Ideally, love and addiction do not have anything at all to do with one another. They are polar opposites. Nothing could be further removed from genuine love, which is conceived as a commitment to mutual growth and fulfillment. Shall I say that again? True love is a commitment to mutual growth and fulfillment. Like the little man in brown robes said, love to love truly is to husband one another, to raise to fullness. So nothing could be further removed from genuine love than the desperate self-seeking dependency, which with drugs we call addiction. Yet in practice, we tend to get them confused. We often say love, quote unquote love, when we really mean and are acting out an addiction. A sterile, ingrown dependency relationship with another person serving as the object of our need for security. This interpersonal dependency is not like an addiction, not something analogous to addiction. It is an addiction. It is every bit as much an addiction as drug dependency. In today's uncertain world, there are many people who can identify with the experience of unwise or desperate love. And there are many people who can identify with the experiences of aimlessness and self-doubt, fear, and escapism. Some of these people may find that this broadened concept of addiction gives them a concrete way to interpret their experiences. So in this sense, too, Love and Addiction is a personal book, one whose relevance can only be accurately interpreted by each individual. This book about addiction focuses on interpersonal relationships. Its main purpose is to explore what addiction really is, psychologically, socially, and culturally. It does this in two ways. First, by showing what really happens when a person becomes dependent or resists becoming dependent on a drug. Second, by showing how the same process may occur in other areas of our everyday lives, especially our relationships with those with whom we are most intimately involved. The first part of this exploration is relatively straightforward, since much of it has already been done. Drug researchers have shown convincingly that it is not drugs that addict people, but people who addict themselves. Heroin and morphine do not always produce the physical symptoms that we associate with addiction. While these same symptoms can and do occur with drugs such as cigarettes and coffee, depending on the user's cultural background, expectations, mood, and emotional needs. Once we have reviewed this research, all that remains is to interpret the addiction process to bring out its relevance to love and other human involvements. For if addiction is now known not to be primarily a matter of drug chemistry or body chemistry, and if we therefore have to broaden our conception of dependency-creating objects to include a wider range of drugs, then why stop with drugs? Why not look at the whole range of things, activities, and even people to which we can and do become addicted? We must, in fact, do this if addiction is to be made a viable concept once again. At present, addiction as a scientific notion is falling into disuse because of the mass of contradictory data about drugs and their effects. Since people who take narcotics often do not get addicted, scientists are beginning to think that addiction does not exist. Yet more casually, we find the word being used in an increasing number of contexts. Addicted to work, addicted to gambling, and so on, because it describes something real that happens to people. Addiction does exist, and it is a large issue in human psychology. An understanding of addiction will help answer the question of why we repeatedly return to things we have done before, the question of habit. Addiction can be considered a pathological habit. It occurs with human necessities such as food and love, as well as with things which people can't do without, such as heroin and nicotine. In other words, addiction is not something mysterious, something about which our ordinary experience has nothing to say. It is a malignant outgrowth, an extreme, unhealthy manifestation of normal human inclinations. We can recognize examples of addiction in ourselves even when we would not characterize ourselves entirely or even basically as addicts. This is why the idea of addiction can be an important tool in our self-understanding. But for its value to be realized, it must be redefined. There has to be a fundamental change in the way we think about addiction. What we think drugs do influences what they can do. And by studying drugs, we learn about our attitudes towards ourselves. Questions of self-mastery and mastery over the environment provide the key to the susceptibility to addiction. When we think of drugs as overpowering, it's because we doubt our own psychological strength. The social history of America's evolving reactions to mind-altering drugs, even drugs such as marijuana and LSD, which are not regarded as addictive, tells us a lot about how we view our own strength as individuals and as a society. It tells us, in other words, about our predisposition to give ourselves over to addiction, to drugs, to people, to anything. Interpersonal addiction, which is love addiction, is just about the most common yet least recognized form of addiction. Highlighting it helps break down the stereotype of the drug addict and arrive at a better understanding of the way addiction affects us all. On the other side, the antithesis of addiction is a true relatedness to the whole world. And There's no more powerful expression of that relatedness than love or true responsiveness to another person. The issue of love versus addiction is one that's very close to our lives, and thus one that we can do something about as individuals. The environment that is most important to us is the human one. This is why when we get addicted, we tend to get addicted to people. Similarly, our best hope of breaking out of addiction is by learning better ways of dealing with people. This is true not only for romantic involvements, but also for family ties and friendships. Our families have a tremendous impact on our addictive or non-addictive potential, since they teach us either self-confidence or helplessness, self-sufficiency or dependency. Outside the family, much of our modern social environment takes the form of organizations such as schools. Our experiences with such institutions can instill in us serious doubts about our capacity to manage our own lives, let alone to interact creatively with the rest of the world. And in reality, they may keep us from developing that capacity to the fullest. Here's where the impulse toward escape and dependency arises. One of the best things we can do to safeguard ourselves against addiction, therefore, is to understand how our social environment affects us and to develop the internal strength to become something more than just creatures of society. Addiction is not a chemical reaction. Addiction is an experience, one which grows out of an individual's routine, subjective response to something that has special meaning for him, something, anything, that he finds so safe and so reassuring that he cannot be without it. If we want to come to terms with addiction, we have to stop blaming drugs and start looking at people, at ourselves, and at what makes us dependent. We still find that we learn habits of dependence by growing up in a culture which teaches a sense of personal inadequacy, a reliance on external bulwarks, and a preoccupation with the negative or the painful rather than the positive or the joyous. Addiction is not an abnormality in our society. It's not an aberration from the norm. It is itself the norm. The dependency, which is addiction, is a mirror image of more basic dependencies that we learn at home and in school. The addict's search for a superficial, external resolution of life, whether through drugs or so-called love, follows directly from the superficial, external relationships we are led to have with each other, with our own minds and our own bodies, with the physical world, with learning and work and play. Those young people who suddenly repudiate convention and seek solace in drugs or a religious commune are only expressing tendencies that were always present in acceptable guises in their home and school lives. Excessive parental supervision, artificial criteria for learning, and a reverential attitude toward established institutions such as organized medicine, along with other cultural influences, combine to leave us without moorings in our direct daily experience. What can be done to combat this widespread addictive drift? We can start by gathering tools of self-analysis, developing criteria for assessing our personal involvements and raising questions that may not ordinarily occur to us. Asking whether a certain kind of quote unquote love may in fact be an addiction can be the first step toward examining, re-examining, and restructuring a life. In part 2 of this thought for the day, we're going to look at the whole subject of marriage, the marriage match. So as you go through the day, ask yourself, is the relationship that you consider to be the most important relationship in your life one that is addictive? Or does it really, is it really based on a commitment to nurturing the full development of that individual, encouraging them to follow their dreams and their heart? That is critical, or it's not love. True love is wishing another well. So think about that, wishing another well and helping to nurture them to become the best human they can be. Anything else is like a tether that keeps them from doing exactly what they need to do for their own soul, heart, mind development. So tune into yourself and be honest with yourself. Are your relationships just dependencies? And make a great day.